Good morning, Professor Reynolds. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's very good to be with you.
We're here with our sixth form historians who have some questions for you pertaining to World War II as part of our VE Day remembrance at Hampton School. So I'll hand over to Jake first off.
So in history lessons, we've been studying political events during and after World War II from a British perspective. What can you tell us about the international history of this time?
Well, it's a good question, and one that one can break up in different ways. I think one of the things that we have to remember is that, we talk about Britain in the war, but Britain was at the center of an empire, British Empire, and that empire was fundamental to waging the war and winning the war. And students around at your school might well have been aware of this at quite an early stage. So I was thinking, you're not that far from what was then the very big military base at Aldershot, southwest of you. Now, by early 1941, two divisions of soldiers from Canada were based at Aldershot. They were actually part of the plans for repulsing a German invasion. They were the sort of second line of defense for London. Now you think, those guys have come 3,000 miles away. Why are they doing that? Boys would have heard about the Battle of Alamein in 1942. A third of the British Army's infantry in that battle were from the Empire and the Commonwealth, Australia, New Zealand, and also a very important Indian contingent. The Indian Army was a big part of the British war effort. So those are reminders that this was a global war. Britain was an empire, and of course less obvious, but tremendously important. A lot of our supplies still came from the empire, from overseas, from Canada, the United States, South America, Australia, and so on. And those had to be brought by ship, not by plane. And it's interesting, Winston Churchill said in his war memoirs that he didn't really lose a lot of sleep about the possibility of a German invasion in 1940. He thought that they weren't in a position to do it, and the channel and command of the air would be too difficult. But what he lost sleep about was the Battle of the Atlantic in 1942. If our shipping lanes had been strangled, then and remember, all the supplies from Australia had to come around South Africa and up the Atlantic because you couldn't get through the Suez Canal and the Mediterranean. If those supply lines had been strangled, we would have got to a point where the rations and the imports were not enough to keep the war effort going. So this was a global war, and in some ways boys would have seen it, in other ways they wouldn't, but it was fundamental to Britain fighting the conflict. I mean, there is also, I think, another dimension to this, which is that you would have, certainly everybody would have heard about the fall of Singapore in February 1942. The surrender of Singapore to the Japanese army as part of this onslaught of Japanese power across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, 1941-42. And although we tend to think now about the crucial part of the war as being 1940 and the Battle of Britain and the survival of Britain then, if you're thinking about Britain as an empire, the fall of Singapore did more damage to the basis of the British Empire, the credibility of Britain as an imperial power, than anything that happened in Europe. And I think it's important as historians that we don't keep our eyes too much on one facet of a problem. We keep thinking about others. We look laterally, as you might say, and thinking about the global war in those sort of ways is important, I think, if you want to understand Britain's success in getting through to victory in 45, and also how costly that victory was in the short term and the longer term.
Thank you very much indeed. Ross, would you like to ask a question next?
Yeah, so You've mentioned about all these great sacrifices that the Commonwealth and the Commonwealth forces had to face. And obviously after the war, as a result of these sacrifices, they expected something in return. So I wanted to ask, what impact did the war have on British decolonisation? Because the war put much more financial and social pressure on the empire, but there were already calls for independence before the war in the British Empire. So do you think decolonisation would have happened at such a rapid pace if the war hadn't have occurred?
No, it's a good question, and I agree with you. I think that it speeded up, the consequences of the war speeded up a process that was gradually happening anyway. If you think about the policy of British governments around the time of the First World War and after, it was to give what was called dominion status to the countries of what were then called the White Commonwealth: Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa. So they were, in practical terms, independent for their domestic affairs. They still relied on Britain for defense. The big debate in the 1930s was whether you did that for India as well. And there were parts of the political spectrum that were keen to do this. The Labour Party was, the national government was, in a cautious way. Others, like Winston Churchill, were very much opposed to it. And after the war, the Labour government that came in 1945 was quite clear that Britain's position in India was no longer tenable. It was not possible to rule that country. British rule had always depended on a degree of consensus or acceptance. It could never have been done simply by naked power. And the consensus no longer existed. And so that's why very rapidly the British government, the Labour government, conceded independence to India and Burma in 1947 because of the feeling that this was on the cards anyway, but it really had to be done. Once they started the process, of course, it got out of control, and you had some terrible human tragedies in India and in the breakup of the Indian Raj between India and Pakistan. But this was a story that was going to happen. It happened faster, and because of the war, and that, if you like, is one of the ways in which winning the war also meant losses for the British. For Britain had to rethink the nature of its role in the world. And that, of course, is a process that we've been carrying on doing ever since.
Yeah.
Another aspect, if I would just like to mention, is, of course, that there is the whole question of the role of the Soviet Union in the war, which is one that I think we tend to airbrush out now or play down. But if you were a schoolboy in 1942, one of the things that would have certainly hit you from the newsreels, was all the reports of the Red Armies fighting in the Soviet Union, Battle of Stalingrad at the end of 1942, and a growing feeling in Britain that we weren't doing enough to support the Russians. They were doing our fighting for us because there wasn't any second front, as it was called, no landing on the continent of Europe in 42 or indeed in 43. And the Russian war effort is one that is huge and very difficult for us to take in. The statistics, you can't really get your head around. It's maybe 27, 28 million dead, perhaps a seventh of the pre-war population. We don't really know. But one of the things that I often say to try and make it more concrete is that more Russians died in the siege of Leningrad, the city of Leningrad, what is now St. Petersburg. More Russians died in the siege of Leningrad than the whole British and American dead from the total Second World War put together. And that's a really rather frightening story, I think. One of the things it also illustrates is, of course, that the sort of moral complexities of fighting a war. Winston Churchill said, there's only one thing worse than fighting with allies, and that's fighting without them. In other words, they're always a problem fighting with other countries and with them, but boy, we need them in certain circumstances. And the Soviet Union was a particular problem because, of course, the ideology was totally different. And at the end of the war, one of the benefits that Stalin extracted from victory was to take control of Eastern Europe. So history raises for us a lot of moral problems which we have to wrestle with, as well as just, I think, the sort of factual ones. So that's another aspect of the war that I think is important. Sorry, you got some more questions?
Josh, would you like to ask a question?
So Professor Reynolds, you mentioned the advantages that Britain had based on, in terms of resources and supplies, in having such a strong empire. But how do you think their kind of imperial strength shaped the war strategy by British leaders during the Second World War?
Well, again, it's a good question, and of course, it was an imperial strategy because that was the nature of British power. So, for example, you have a big debate in 1941 about what is the second most important thing to do apart from defending these islands. And Churchill is quite clear that the defense of North Africa, the Mediterranean, Egypt, the Suez Canal is the most significant thing to do. Quite a few of the military, the chiefs of staff, say there is a real long-term threat to the security of Australia, New Zealand, India, the Far Eastern Empire, and that means we ought to move the fleet, or have the fleet ready to move to Singapore rather than concentrating on the Mediterranean. This is a big argument. And in the end, as we see, the British do not have enough navy to cover 3 wars simultaneously. They make a choice between waging war in Mediterranean, North Africa, and being unable to hold on to the Far Eastern Empire. Churchill is quite clear, like many people, he doesn't expect the strength of the Japanese advance in the end of 1941, beginning of 42. And that's why this sort of, if you like, complacency about Singapore means that there is this total disaster in Southeast Asia in terms of our loss of power. And that's, of course, a reminder, again, we can see it in debates about politics today, that leaders find it hard to keep their eyes on all the balls at once. You focus on 1 or 2 problems, you don't think, you think some of the others are not so important. And, you know, the arguments we've had about, you know, was the government prepared for COVID-19 and all that kind of thing? Was it looking in the right directions? This is a familiar challenge for all governments. And one of the things I do think is important when we're studying history is that we often take a particular topic. So, you know, you might say, well, I'm interested in British and the colonies or something like this. Anybody running a government is dealing with 101 things every day. They never have enough time to deal with any one problem. They've got to make snap decisions. It's pretty inevitable that something slips through their fingers. But that's the part of the nature of political leadership. I think it's one of the challenges.
Thank you very much, Professor Reynolds. Joe, I know you might have a question for Professor Reynolds, but sir, do you have a question for the gents, just to give you a rest, because I appreciate you're doing lots of talking.
I'm curious to know, this is a slightly different question, but it's relevant to your wider interest. You know, VE Day, thinking about an amazing moment in our history, 75 years ago, 80 years ago. You're living through an amazing moment in our history at the moment. Peter Hennessy, the historian, has said that many people, after this is over, the pandemic, will think of dividing their lives into BC and AC, before COVID, after COVID. Do you have a sense of living at a really remarkable moment in history? Has that grabbed you, or are you just mostly fed up being in lockdown? Because if you're historians, I think you should be thinking about history alive and kicking today as much as 75 years ago. So you have any feelings about that?
Well, I think that it's clearly a pretty momentous moment in Britain's history, and I think it was this week that the death toll passed out of the Blitz, which is a fairly significant marking point in the struggle. And I also think there's definitely a sense of heightened, like, it's the sense of how incredible the moment has been heightened by some of the leadership. So Boris Johnson, I think, is very keen to model himself on Winston Churchill, and that comes across in lots of his speeches, and he's often comparing this to a battle and things like that, which I think only serves to kind of exacerbate the feelings of how momentous the moment is, personally.
I was just gonna add to that. I can only speak from my experience, obviously, but I do feel if we're comparing it to VE Day that there is quite a significant difference, and that was, during the Second World War, I feel like it was a really active, come on, like, dig for victory, let's do this, let's do this. And this is just more passive. I feel like it's more, we'll just sit at home and don't do anything. And I think kind of the difference in tone, which although kind of Boris tries to kind of rile us up and act like it's some sort of kind of like big battle that we need to overcome, I do feel like the kind of passive feeling and the feeling of like our job is just to sit at home rather than like getting out and doing stuff and helping the country, kind of like detracts from the sense of like strong like nationalism and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's interesting what you're saying. I mean, I think the government would say, that by staying home, you're saving lives. So you're doing your bit for the war effort. But I think that, one of the things that strikes me is that, there is, we look back to heroes from the Second World War, but of course, there is clearly a huge amount of heroism going on in the hospitals, in the care homes, and so on. And that is generating, I think, also a new sense of heroes for our own time. You have this remarkable phenomenon of Captain Tom, for example, who's a figure from the Second World War who could easily have said, well, I did my bit then, and I can put my feet up now. And he's saying, look, actually, this is a real struggle, and I'm going to try and do my bit for the people who are in the front line now. And it's caught the imagination of the country. But what I would also say to you is that, I mean, your comments and your feedback I think are fair enough, but we are, if you like to put it in Churchillian terms, we're only at the end of the beginning on this. This is a crisis that is going to take years to have its effect really be seen in the economy, in the way we start changing our lifestyles, thinking questions of travel, air travel, the impact on the environment. And what I think concerns me is that you, as historians, people interested in history, recognize what I feel anyway, is that you are going to be part of shaping this future. And it's going to take a long time. And that being sensitive to how people reacted in the past to big ruptures in our history may help you, as people who are thinking, 10, 20 years going to be leaders in the future, in whatever walk of life, recognize that you need to apply history to the challenges that you are going to face in reshaping this country's life in fundamental ways. That's what will have to happen after this, as this crisis is over.
Do you have any response to that, chaps? It's a really, really interesting idea. Like you in the future.
Well, just like Professor Reynolds was discussing, sort of the unifying of the nation that we've seen under the sort of COVID-19 response. I think it's a real defining moment, and this national unity, the sort of total effort, this total front that we've got now, is probably comparable, as you say, to the sort of total war effort we've seen back in the Second World War. So I certainly think the response and the sort of national unity, pride that it's created with things like the NHS's response, Captain Tom, is certainly comparable, I think, to World War II.
I think people need heroes for their own century and not just heroes from previous centuries. And for me, that's the real lesson of Captain Tom, who is, somebody from that finest hour, and he's saying, actually, you know, we're in a finest hour, we're dealing with the new greatest generation today. And that's part of, you know, for me, being a historian is not just about dwelling on the past, but seeing us in a stream of time that connects us with the past, that has continuity and change, and we are part of shaping history in the future. That's what matters to me.
Fabulous. Professor Reynolds, it has been a really, really interesting interview. I'm absolutely full of gratitude for your time this morning.
It's been fun and been good questions, interesting questions, and that's always what gets me going. So good luck to you all.